Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore the amazing, crazy, and sometimes not very clean bedrooms of medieval kings and queens. Their power, desire, and a complete lack of respect for personal space all mixed together in a big way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is there. It's really interesting to see who's joining us from all over the world. Let's start getting ready for tonight's journey together. First, let's turn the lights down a bit and maybe turn on a fan to make it feel more comfortable. King John of England is also known as John Lackland and is remembered for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and behaving very badly towards most of the nobility's daughters. John was king from 1199 to 1216, and he showed the worst example of how not to behave in public office. It's a political disaster and a personal disaster as well. John didn't just have casual sex, he was a taker. He was known for kidnapping noble women, locking them up in royal castles, and entertaining them until they were either married off somewhere else or forgotten. His favorite way of dealing with powerful families was not by fighting. It involved cheating on his wife and making his husband feel left out, and then making him pay double taxes. It is efficient. Chroniclers did not like how John acted. Even biased medieval scribes, who often ignored witch trials and floggings, wrote things like he was not good with women, and he did not stop himself from having sex with his wives and daughters. That's how people behaved in medieval times. He made the Christmas party really uncomfortable. There was a time when John was officially known to have 30 mistresses. That's not romantic. That's a problem with having enough staff. Some nobles told the king that John was being rude. They said he slept with everyone, including the servants and maybe even the family goat. He behaved so badly that he almost started a rebellion. It wasn't because of taxes or wars. It was because half the barons were afraid to leave their wives on their own during royal visits. One baron said no to meeting John unless his whole household was locked up too. That's how diplomacy was done in the 13th century. John never saw a problem, just like a true royal should. He thought he was irresistible. We only have his own letters to go on. But when you're the king, it's normal to be delusional. In the end, King John left behind a kingdom that was not doing well, and people did not trust each other. He also possibly had several children who no one talked about at court. He was the kind of king who made people invent democracy just so he wouldn't have to leave his family. She wasn't the worst monarch ever, but she definitely wouldn't be your first choice to babysit. Charles VI of France was known by many names. He was also known as Charles the Mad, and ruled from 1380 to 1422. That nickname was earned, not given at a drunken banquet. He started his time in power in a good way. He was young, good-looking, and he could do the job. Then things changed. He started to lose track of who he was. He even attacked his own knights. At one point, he believed he was made of glass. He insisted that his servants wrap him in blankets so that he wouldn't shatter while walking. He doesn't look like a king, but he is impressive when it comes to being creative. Most kings, who think of themselves as delicate and weak, usually try to avoid any kind of scandal. Not Charles. He somehow found time to have a secret girlfriend, a paranoid delusion, and a civil war all at the same time. Charles was a man who did many things at the same time. His wife, Isabel of Bavaria, tried to run the court, but Charles did things like run screaming from mirrors and refuse to bathe for fear the water might dissolve him. At the same time, his mistress, Odette de Sam, was quietly moved into the palace and introduced to everyone as his comfort. This was a way of telling people in medieval times to don't ask questions, just smile. Odette stayed with Charles during his most difficult years. She must have been very patient, or she must have owned a lot of property. She brushed his hair, listened to his incoherent ramblings, and helped him put on lots of padded clothes so he could sit down safely. If you want to show that you are very passionate, you could tie your special someone up in a pillowcase. But Charles was strange even when he was alone. He also hosted court entertainments, but things didn't go well. One time, at an event called the Ball Dearden, he and his friends dressed up as wild men in flammable costumes and danced around with torches. A flame was dropped, and several people burned to death. Charles lived, but he was humiliated. Charles had 12 children, several of whom he fathered during times when he seemed to be thinking clearly, or at least thinking enough to know what he was doing. Royal Chronicles doesn't say if he remembered their names, but it seems likely that naming a child not made of glass was frowned upon. Charles V was the King of France. He was known as the Mad King because he caused his country great harm. Even more impressively, he made mental illness, royal scandals, and medieval pyrotechnics all seem like part of the same tragicomic package. Amazingly, they still let him wear a crown. Peter the Cruel, also known as Pedro the Just, depending on whether you were on his side or not, ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369. He had a strange idea of what romance was. It was a mix of being a royal, being jealous, and sometimes killing people for political reasons. He didn't have much luck in the romance department when he was younger. He fell in love with a kind woman called Maria de Padilla. They may or may not have got married in secret. It's important to keep this part secret, mainly because he was also being married off to other women to create alliances, which made things a bit awkward. One of those women was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman. He married her and then locked her up in a castle for 3 days. Peter decided Maria had prettier hair, and because of that, Maria was kept in prison for the rest of her life. He might not have liked Blanche's way of speaking. It was a very sudden way to end the relationship. Maria was the one thing he was obsessed with. Even when he married other women, he still loved her the most. When she died, Peter was so sad that he cried for days. Then he decided to make her his wife again, even though she had already had 4 of his children. He did this to confuse everyone. But Peter was also interested in other things. He was known for falling in love quickly and strongly, which is not poetic. It's just dangerous. One of his girlfriends, Donna Juanita, tried to leave him. She was later found in pieces, as were several of his political enemies and cousins. Sometimes, people who made eye contact at the wrong moment were also found in pieces. Modern stories say that Peter sometimes watched executions from his balcony while he was out with his mistress. That's not a charming sociopath. That's the HBO villain who can't control his impulses. Even though there was a lot of drama, the Castilian court was never boring. News spread quickly, and Peter's feelings for others made it hard to tell where love ended and anger began. He thought that being romantic meant getting married or divorced without the other person knowing, and sometimes even stabbing them in the back. In the end, Peter was killed by his own half-brother. This was a way of showing how family therapy can go wrong. But he is still known as one of Europe's least romantic people. If love is a battlefield, Peter brought the tools of war. Edward II of England was king from 137 to 1327. He is mostly remembered for 2 things. He lost to the Scots at Bannockburn and showed more love to his male favorites than to his queen. One of those things was seen as a serious crime. The other was a topic of conversation that caused a bit of a stir over dinner. Let's start with Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood friend, rumored lover, and full-time fashion icon. Piers was close to Edward. He was given positions of great importance, estates, titles, and jewelry that didn't match any of his outfits. At Edward's coronation, Piers wore more sparkle than the royal regalia, the official outfit worn by the monarch. He even overshadowed the queen, which is very daring when you think that nobles might not like you. Spoiler, they didn't like him. Isabella of France, Edward's wife, was naturally very angry. She came with certain political ideas and a large amount of money, But she was not happy about sharing the throne with her husband's best friend, who might also be his boyfriend. Edward, however, remained devoted. When the nobles demanded that Piers be sent away, Edward was upset. He sent him away, but then brought him right back. Imagine a teenage breakup, but with castles and crossbows. Eventually, the barons had enough and killed the Piers. Edward was devastated. Imagine a royal family in complete chaos. It's all very medieval, with people getting upset in the morning, openly crying, and all the drama of a soap opera. However, his sadness did not make him think about himself. It made room for something that I really like. This is Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh made Piers look like a small, unimportant detail. He was more than just Edward's mentor. He was basically the second king. Land, property rights, whole counties. Hugh got them. The other nobles were angry. By this point, Isabella had gone from being an annoyed wife to someone who was ready to get even. She teamed up with someone she was having an affair with. Edward's enemy invaded England and overthrew his husband. Edward was put in prison, his crown was taken away, and he was possibly killed by a red-hot poker. Yes, there's a rumor about that. We're not talking about how it works. Let's just say that medieval revenge was rarely subtle. Edward the second time, as king, was more about personal problems than running the country. In fact, it was so full of drama that it could have been a reality TV show. If the Plantagenets had Netflix, his season would have been banned in 3 countries. He made a mistake. He mixed politics with passion, ignored everyone else, and thought he was above the law. In the end, it turned out that everyone could do it. Waslaus of Bohemia was the ruler of the country in the late 14th century, although ruler may be a generous way to describe the role. He was officially known as King of the Romans and King of Bohemia, but he is better remembered for his public nudity, aggressive drinking, and starting fights in his own palace. If you're thinking of the good king from A Christmas Carol, you're wrong. That was his ancestor. This Weslaus is not good at all. He started off well. He was a teenager who was intelligent and could speak more than one language. But then he decided that the royal wine cellar was better than the treasury and started making decisions from the bottom of a goblet. Wislaus became known for its long drinking sessions, where important decisions were made while enjoying mead and singing silly songs. His advisors started carrying flasks so they could survive the negotiations, not because they wanted to drink. In court, people would often end a debate by throwing a table or being challenged to a duel with breadsticks. He also started the nice habit of running through the castle, sometimes during meetings. One writer records that Wislaus gave out royal orders completely naked, except for a sword belt. He says that clothes are for people who are shy. It's hard to disagree with that logic when the guy with the crown also has a long sword and no trousers. When it came to romance, he was drawn to women like barmaids, lawnmowers, and sometimes even nobles' wives. But he seemed more interested in their beer suggestions than their feelings. Nobody thought it was wrong for him to have affairs at his court. They were basically job interviews. One nobleman said he had slept with his sister. Wislaus gave him a shrug and offered him a drink. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire decided they had had enough of his royal vodka and removed him as king of the Romans. This was a polite way of saying, "You're fired, but we're pretending it's political." Even his own brother said he was useless, undressed, and usually unconscious. Even so, Wislaus managed to rule Bohemia for many years. His people put up with him the way you put up with a loud uncle at a wedding, with eye rolls, making sure he sat somewhere quiet, and plenty of alcohol. In the end, he left behind a kingdom that was not very stable, a wine cellar that was flooded, and a royal legacy that can be summed up as follows. He ruled as if every day was his last hangover. Henry VIII of England is an example of what can happen when you give someone a lot of power and they have strong feelings. He was king from 159 to 1547. He spent most of this time either getting married, getting divorced, or getting angry with the Pope for not supporting his strange decisions about who he dated. You've heard the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that doesn't even begin to cover everything about Henry's royal rom-com that has turned into a horror series. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, the first wife. Henry and his wife had been married for 20 years. He decided that God was angry with him for not having a son. The solution wasn't to think deeply about the situation. It was a process of punishment that led to being cut off from the church and creating a new church. He invented Anglicanism just to keep up with someone else. That's not devotion. That's a petty thing to do at a cathedral. In Berlin is the second wife. Henry wrote her love letters that were full of passion and obsession, and he wrote them really badly. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. However, she did not have any sons. This led to her being arrested for having an affair, practicing witchcraft, and possibly giving false evidence in court. She had her head cut off. Henry was in a bad mood and felt like a potato. Jane Seymour was next, and she gave birth to a son, Edward. Sadly, she died from problems during childbirth. Henry was very sad when his wife died. He waited 11 days before he started dating again. Henry chose Anne of Cleves because he liked the picture of her. He said that in real life, she looked like a Flanders mare. That marriage only lasted 6 months and ended with what we would now call a no-fault divorce and a politely written review on the website Yelp. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife, was much younger and much less discreet. She was killed for having an affair, but it's hard to blame her. When she was married to Henry, she had to deal with problems like gout and paranoia. Henry could hardly walk, but he still thought he was a gift to women. Catherine Parr was wife number 6. She was clever, patient, and good at avoiding accusations. She outlived him because she was literate. By the time Henry died, he had run out of money, eaten half the animals in the country, and made the royal court a soap opera where people were getting kicked out more often than getting married. Henry VIII was a big lover, a big ruler, and a big drama queen. He was so dramatic that his story is still being made into musicals today. Francis I of France was the perfect example of the Renaissance. He ruled from 1515 to 1547. He was very cultured, charming, and sophisticated, but he was completely unable to keep his trousers buttoned. He was a great supporter of the arts. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, built amazing palaces, and helped make France a big cultural force. While the painters were painting and the poets were writing poetry, Francis was busy seducing anything that had a pulse and a name. His court was famous, or maybe not so famous, for how fancy it was, but also for being a kind of dating app that was paid for by the state. He employed gentlewomen of the bedchamber, a term that should have meant ladies-in-waiting, but really meant a romantic shortlist. Francis accidentally slept with the ambassador's wife, which caused political alliances to fall apart. This was not just a small, secret affair. Francis was very vocal about it. He once told important people from other countries that French kings were supposed to be great lovers. This sounds good until you realize that he was the kind of man who didn't care about treaties or his mistresses. In other words, he only cared about them for a short time. His most famous relationship was with Françoise de Vauchel, a woman of noble background, who became his official mistress. She was funny, smart, and probably the only woman who could make fun of him in front of everyone and not get into trouble. She was eventually replaced by Cecil de Haley, a woman whose name sounds like a medieval inside joke. De Haley was as politically influential as she was good at staying in the game. Even his enemies couldn't help but see. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once said that Francis was more dangerous when it came to sex than when fighting in a war. He meant it as an insult. Francis probably thought it was a compliment. Even though he was busy with meetings, parties, and friendly chats, Francis still managed to rule effectively. Even though he liked to spend a lot of money on wars, and even more on women, you could never doubt how enthusiastic he was. His time in power was very exciting, with lots of silk, scandal, and secondhand perfume. Francis, was more than just a king. He was the most charming historical figure who caused France a lot of problems. To be honest, he would not want it any other way. Alonso XI of Castile was king from 1311 to 1350. As well as ruling a kingdom, his biggest hobby was ignoring his wife in the most obvious and extravagant way possible. Maria of Portugal was his wife, and she was not very good at making political plans. Noble, well-connected, and not Leonor de Guzman, the woman Alonso actually cared about. Leonor was a noble woman from Castile. She was clever, had 11 children, and had enough influence to basically run the court herself. She didn't need a crown to make her feel important, unlike Maria. She just needed Alonso to be completely and shamelessly obsessed with her. Most kings had female lovers. Alonso made her into a shadow queen. He built the Leonor palaces and gave her land. He also took her everywhere. Meanwhile, Queen Maria was left sitting alone at royal events, like a centerpiece that nobody wanted. Meanwhile, Alonso was looking at his side chick, who was not even trying to hide it. To make things more complicated or easier, depending on how much you like medieval soap operas, Leonor wasn't just a mistress. She was very interested in politics. She negotiated treaties, and people respected her. She also had children, but this was her main job, and it was quite important. Alfonso didn't want to seem like he cared about Maria. He only met her once, and it was just to make it look good for the other people. After that, he left and went back to Leonor's house, as if he didn't want to get married. Maria's dad, who was the king of Portugal, was not happy about this. At one point, things got so bad between countries because of the situation that a war almost happened. Picture this. Your husband's parents are so furious about your mistress that they're thinking about taking military action. But Alonso didn't care. He kept showing off Leonor to everyone in the court like she was a prize. He probably would have kept doing this forever if he hadn't died from the Black Death in 1350. That's right. His affair was ended by a plague. After Alonso died, Queen Maria finally got her moment in the spotlight. She had Leonor put in prison and killed, which most historians call vengeful, and which most of us would call extremely fair. People may remember Alonso's rule for its military victories, but let's be honest. He is most famous for being one of the kings in medieval history who was whipped in public the most. Philip IV of France was also known as Philip the Fair. He ruled from 1285 to 1314. People called him by his nickname because he was good-looking, but he didn't behave well. Philip looked like a religious and serious person who was committed to making the world a better place. Deep down, he felt like his kingdom was like a reality show, but a tense one. It felt like there was always someone betraying him, and he thought the way people acted in the bedroom was unfair. His most well-known scandal was the Tour d'Enfer affair, a medieval sex scandal so shocking it could have been made into a TV show by HBO. The whole thing began when Isabella, Philip's daughter, the same Isabella who would later overthrow Edward II of England, noticed that her sisters-in-law were getting a bit too friendly with some knights. They were friendly in a strange way, like they were exchanging gifts and meeting secretly. Isabella told Philip, who started a big investigation, using the same strong methods as a sledgehammer. Two of the princesses who were married to Philip's sons were found guilty of cheating on their husbands. They were sent to prison where everyone could see them, and they had to spend years there. They had their heads shaved, their titles were taken away, and their reputations were completely destroyed. The two knights involved were tortured, skinned alive, and killed in the public square. This is an example of how being a good leader is all about making a family argument seem like a medieval movie. Things are about to get interesting. While Philip was handing out cruel punishments like candy, rumors spread that he himself had a few secret lovers hidden away in private rooms of the Louvre. Some people said he had a secret group of young women who would entertain important visitors. But unlike his daughters-in-law, nobody ever asked questions about the king's personal life. When you're the one creating the rules, it's incredible how sin can become a clever plan. Philip was also good at using religion when it suited him. He targeted the Knights Templar because of their supposed heresy, but everyone knew it was really about their money. It was like what would happen if you arrested your banker in medieval times and thought that was just and fair. So, Philip might have looked very religious and honorable, but behind his perfect face and cold eyes was a man who was very dishonest and knew all the castle's secret doors. Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary and King of the Romans, and later Holy Roman Emperor, was a kind of man who collected crowns the way other men collected wine goblets, which he also collected with great enthusiasm. Sigismund was clever, spoke many languages, and was very good at politics. He ruled from the late 14th to the mid-15th century. He also had a personal life that was so scandalous that even a bawdy drunk would blush. First, Sigismund was married to Queen Mary of Hungary. She was a powerful woman in her own right, but getting married to Sigismund was just a polite formality. He liked his relationships to be less serious, to happen more often, and to be without any conversation afterwards. He was a romantic and had a lot of different romantic projects. These included noble women, lauresses, and at least one Italian opera singer. Opera didn't exist at that time, so this shows that he was very innovative. Court officials often forgot about the women he was seeing. It wasn't because there were a lot of them, but because they changed all the time. Some historians think they only started numbering them at a certain point. At the court, the mistresses of the nobles had their own living space, servants, and sometimes a private chapel. This seems either very romantic or very inappropriate, depending on whether you think it's okay to pray next to someone's mistress. Sigismund also liked to dress up. He liked to dress as a normal person and sneak into towns. Sometimes it was for spying, and sometimes it was to flirt with local women, pretending to be a very tall merchant. Apparently, nobody thought anything was wrong, even though he was the only merchant with a group of servants wearing royal crests. And yet the man ruled for decades. He started wars, met with the Council of Constance, and changed imperial politics. He also had many affairs that would make even Casanova seem boring by comparison. One ambassador once wrote that Sigismund treats all women as equals, especially when they are not in public. This might be seen as a bit forward-thinking, but it also sounds like it might be against the rules. But even though he had a lot of extracurricular activities, Sigismund was still very popular. This was mostly because he looked like a king when he was out in public, even though he had a very messy love life. He was more than just an emperor. He was a very important and interesting person. He was a good planner, a good leader, and he caused some very big arguments. He always managed to get away with it. Louis XV was the King of France. He ruled from 1715 to 1774. He was known as Louis the Beloved. By ruled, we mostly mean that he hosted a royal party which went on for a long time. The people at the party did not have to do anything, and they wore silk bed sheets. He seemed like a good start. He was young, good-looking, and he was set to follow in the footsteps of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV. But in his 20s, Louis decided that national policy could wait because he had a long list of women to see. Let's talk about the Parco serfs the small house near Versailles that Louis used for private auditions. They would recruit girls, usually poor, but pretty ones. They would bring them in secretly and rotate them in and out like seasonal fruit and veg. There were so many mistresses that the palace guards probably had a system where they kept a list of all the mistresses. His most famous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, was more than just a pretty face. She was the one who did all the behind-the-scenes work in France. When she lost interest in the physical side of their relationship, Louis said that was okay. They built a second harem instead. The logic is simple. Keep the Pompadour for the important discussions and the parquet for everything else. It was a very disorganized mess. When their contracts finished, the girls were given presents, names, and in some cases, their own homes. It was France's most informal but surprisingly effective internship program. The queen, Marie Leczinska, was there, but she was mostly ignored. After she stopped having children, Louise treated her like old furniture. It's too expensive to throw away, but it doesn't fit in a room anymore. The scandal at court was so common that nobles didn't think to ask if the king had a mistress. They asked how many of these there were this week. Even foreign ambassadors wrote about how often the furniture was being replaced at Versailles. That's not a monarchy. That's a brothel with uniforms that look nicer. Surprisingly, Louis really believed he was a good ruler. He believed he was good at organizing fancy parties, keeping his wife's pregnancy secret, and dealing with awkward moments when he didn't know what to say to her. His time as king was not completely awful, but it did set the tone for his grandson, Louis VI, who would later be executed. This might have happened because Louis's grandfather spent too much time wearing the wrong crown. Louis XIV died with a lot of debt. The royal court was unhappy, and he was not popular with accountants. Christian VII of Denmark was king from 1766 to 1808. Though ruled might not be the right word for what he did. It's more accurate to say that he stumbled through life while other people were in charge of the country. Christian had a few problems. He had a serious mental illness, probably schizophrenia, and he wasn't really interested in being king, except when he got to chase servants with knives and forks, which he thought was really funny. This made him more like a mascot for the royal family than the king himself. Christian's wife was Caroline Matilda of Great Britain. She was a sensible young woman who expected a fairly normal marriage. She got a husband who liked to masturbate in public, talk to his hand, and leave during state dinners to imagine riding imaginary horses down palace corridors. We don't know what happened first. Did she lose patience? Or did he start to lose his grip on reality? The king's doctor, Jan Friedrich Struensee, arrived. Struensee was smart, ambitious, and very interested in power. He quickly became the real ruler of Denmark, and a little awkwardly, the queen's lover. Yes, that's correct. Caroline Matilda's life became like a soap opera, with her having an affair with her husband's doctor. The king did not notice or care. Struensee was in charge of the laws and edicts, and made sure that Christian was kept busy with puppet shows, sword games, and being gently nudged away from sharp objects. It was perhaps the only love triangle in history where one person was quietly thinking about the other two people. Caroline and Struy had a child together. The child was considered the king's son in theory, but not in practice. For a while, the two of them were in charge of Denmark. They ran the country in a modern and a bit controversial way. But royal courts are rarely relaxed places. Eventually, Christian's mother-in-law found out about the affair and took control of the situation. Struens was arrested, tortured, and killed in a very dramatic way. Caroline was sent away, and her reputation was ruined. Christian was back to being a bit of a liability, and he spent the rest of his time in a kind of silent protest. People remember his reign more for how strange it was than for what he did. He was a king who didn't rule, a queen who tried her best, and a physician who tried a little too hard. People call it a constitutional crisis. We call it the weirdest love story in Europe. Charles II of England, who ruled from 1660 to 1685, came back from exile with one clear plan: bring back fun, and preferably as many mistresses as possible. Spoiler, mission accomplished. After surviving a civil war, hiding in oak trees, and living in poverty, Charles returned to England as king. He quickly decided that the country needed less strict religious beliefs and more ballroom dancing where people wear less clothing. Parliament agreed, but not happily. Charles was known as the Merry Monarch, and he had lots of official mistresses. We only know about a few of them. His most famous love interest was Nell Gwynn, a clever and outspoken actress who once called herself the Protestant to set herself apart from the other mistresses. To be honest, it's a really well-known brand. Then there was Barbara Palmer, who was known as the Countess of Castlemaine. She was more of a regular in the palace than a mistress. She was kept in the royal apartments and had lots of children with Charles. All of her children were given titles and land, because it's more fun when you're flirty with your family. Charles didn't try to be quiet. He took his mistresses with him to court events. He paid them using money from the government. He even had a corridor built at Whitehall so that the ambassadors could get to his bedroom without bothering him. Efficiency. Their name is Charles. Queen Catherine of Banza, his wife, put up with everything and drank alcohol to help her cope. She didn't have any children, and Charles is said to have said, "She couldn't have children, but she never gave me any trouble." This is both a compliment and a warning. Charles had at least 14 children out of wedlock, and he took responsibility for most of them. He gave them noble titles and threw big birthday parties for them. At the same time, the rightful heir was born without any children, as if fate had a sense of humor. People liked Charles, even though there were some problems. He reopened theaters, made fun legal again, and brought back the monarchy with plenty of flair, wigs, and more eyeliner than his actresses. People forgave him everything, mostly because he made the monarchy look like a fun party. When he died, he said, "Don't let poor Nellie starve. God bless England. And don't tell my brother to rule wisely. Just feed the mistress." That's what Charles II was like as a king. He acted like he was at a party for single men. Eric XIV of Sweden was king from 1560 to 1568. He was king for a short time, but he made an impact. He made people paranoid, wrote poetry, and he did really bad things in the love department. Eric began his reign with great promise. He was tall, handsome, interested in astronomy and the arts. He was the kind of king who might write you a love poem and then explain how the planets move around the sun over dinner. He was also obsessed with astrology, so he hardly ever made a decision without checking the stars first. Sadly, the stars never told him to relax. Eric liked noble women, but not in a subtle way, like if he whispered in a garden. He asked Queen Elizabeth I of England to marry him lots of times, but she said no every time. Say hello politely, then firmly, and then don't say anything for a moment. Eric didn't understand the hint. He even sent portraits of himself as gifts. This is the 16th century equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs with a shirtless selfie and a marriage contract. After Elizabeth stopped communicating with him, Eric decided to look for someone with a lower rank, not someone who was more enthusiastic. He fell in love with Karen Munn's daughter, who was not from a noble family and whose father was a prison guard. The nobility was outraged by this, but this only made Eric more determined. He married her, made her queen, and then spent the next year being very emotional, putting nobles in prison and stabbing people he thought looked at her strangely. His most infamous moment was when he killed a nobleman during a casual dinner party. He shouted while he was killing the nobleman with a knife. His friends and advisors thought that maybe astrology had finally gone mad. At this point, he was hearing voices, hiding from enemies you couldn't see, and sometimes dressing up to spy on his own council. The nobles got involved, which in royal terms means they locked him in a castle and gave the crown to his brother. Eric was imprisoned for the rest of his life. While he was there, he wrote strange love poems to Karen. He also sometimes wrote about conspiracies and probably regretted stabbing that guy during dinner. Sweden learned a few things from Eric's time in charge. Make sure you check that there are no hidden blades on your dinner guests. Don't be fooled by kings who claim to write their own horoscopes. And maybe, just maybe, don't make the man who says the moon is talking about betrayal the winner. Ferdinand I of Naples, also known as Ferdinand of Aragon, ruled from the mid-5th century. He was a rare mix of charming and brutal, and he had a hobby that would make most people cancel their dinner plans straight away. At first glance, Ferdinand was a well-organized and effective ruler. He made his kingdom stable, balanced the budget, and quickly put an end to rebellions. But he was a friendly dictator who used psychological warfare to get what he wanted. For example, the way he deals with his enemies. Most kings sent traitors into exile. Some people put them in prison. Ferdinand liked to stuff them. Yes, the practice of making humans look like animals. After killing rebellious nobles, he had their bodies put on display in a private museum under his castle. It was called the Black Room, and he gave tours of it to important visitors from other countries, like ambassadors and even people who might be spies. There's nothing more effective at encouraging someone to behave than by showing them their mistakes in politics. He liked to describe the dead bodies, using their names, the crime they were suspected of, and how they looked. Some were positioned in the middle of the screen, while others had plaques. One guest passed out. Ferdinand thought it was really funny. If TripAdvisor had been around, the reviews would have been 5 stars and really unsettling. You would not be able to stop reading them. Ferdinand was known for running the most haunting gallery in Europe, but he also had a reputation for being a bit of a romantic rebel. He had many children out of wedlock, and a lot of them ended up with titles and land. Ferdinand's official queen was just one of many, and it seems like he didn't take marriage too seriously. The men he slept with included noble women and peasants, and they all had one thing in common. He was not at all careful about discretion. Royal banquets were sometimes also used as a chance for people to try and catch the king's attention. One ambassador said that Ferdinand always ate a variety of different courses, including political ones. Even so, Ferdinand was still well-liked. His people admired how strong he was. The nobles were afraid of him, and any visitors who came to see the Black Room quickly decided not to rebel. He was king for many years, died in his bed, and left the kingdom to his heirs. Ferdinand's legacy is a kingdom that is stable, a scary basement, and the firm understanding that some kings build alliances, while others collect warning signs in glass cases. The year was 119. The dust of the First Crusade was still on the broken stones of Jerusalem. Lots of Christian pilgrims went to the Holy Land, thinking the sacred city was now safe. But outside the city walls, things were very disorderly. Bandits were lurking along the roads. Muslim war bands attacked caravans, killing travelers or selling them into slavery. The dream of Christians being safe in the East was coming to an end. That's when a knight named Hug Dion and 8 of his friends promised to serve God, not a king or a lord. They promised to do everything they could to protect Christian pilgrims, not just as soldiers, but also as monks. They promised to live a simple life, to remain pure, and to do whatever they were told. They had no wives, no gold, and no land, but they had horses, swords, and faith. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Yes, that last phrase was important. King Baldwin II allowed them to stay on the Temple Mount, where the ruins of Solomon's temple were. The Knights Templar got their name from this sacred place. For 9 years, they were a small, unofficial, underfunded, and dangerously committed group. They lived very simply, borrowing weapons and horses, and training constantly. But they were strict, religious, and dangerous, and people started to talk about them. It wasn't long before the strange mix of monk and warrior got the attention of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most important men in Christendom. Bernard was not an ordinary abbot. He was a really spiritual rock star. When he spoke, popes listened, seeing something special in these men. He helped to create the official rules of the Templars at the Council of Troyes in 1129. These rules were strict and monastic, and were designed to make the Templars behave well. He praised them as a new kind of knighthood, a holy elite who fought not for glory, but for God. With Bernard's support and the Pope's agreement, the Knights Templar were now seen as a group of people with a purpose. They became a religious group that was officially approved by the church. People gave a lot of money. Young nobles left their comfortable lives to join their group. The Templars were rising from the dirt of Jerusalem. They were holy, hungry, and now officially unstoppable. But they didn't know that the thing they valued most, the independence of the Pope, would one day lead to their death. The Knights Templar were no longer just monks with swords. They had the Pope's approval, and their white mantles were stitched with blood-red crosses. They were the violent followers of Christianity. The Christian strongholds in the Middle East were always under threat from the Islamic resistance, and the Templars were now the last line of defense. Their code was straightforward. Never retreat unless you are outnumbered 3-1. They won't pay any ransoms, they won't show any mercy, and they won't be afraid. They trained every day, fought with extreme discipline, and believed that dying in battle was the highest honor. While most knights fought for treasure and glory, the Templars fought for the right cause. They were like God's anger on horseback. They showed how valuable they were during the Second Crusade. While the disorganized lords were fighting amongst themselves and failed to take Damascus, the Templars stayed united and successfully fought their way through the enemy. They became famous for their brave attacks and battles. It wasn't just because they were good at it. It was their reputation. Muslim commanders started to mention them in their reports about battles. The white-mantled devils with the red cross. They didn't just fight, they made their position stronger. The Knights Templar built lots of castles and outposts all over the Holy Land. Safatosa and the strong fortress of Bagras. These were not just pretty gardens. Templar castles were military strongholds. They had thick walls, trap-laden gates, and water systems that could last for a year if the castle was being attacked. When armies ran away, the Templars stayed where they were to buy time or die. But they were loyal not to kings or emperors, but only to the Pope. This made them very unusual, and rulers both admired and feared them. A king could not command them. A baron couldn't pay them to do something. Only the Grand Master, who was chosen from within, could give the order to fight or stand down. They were strong and brave, even as they suffered for their beliefs. They weren't just looking for soldiers. They were creating a myth. Their ceremonies were kept secret. They had total control over their steers, and they were very strict disciplinarians. A lot of people thought they were sacred. Some people think it's a bad sign. Even so, they became more and more popular. They had changed from 9 dusty knights into an elite order that spread across continents. But when someone becomes famous, people start talking. And when people talk, they can feel envious. The sword of God had become sharp, but one day it would be pointed at them. They started out with borrowed armor and promised to live simply. However, within 100 years, the Knights Templar were more than just warriors. They were the financial institution that everyone trusted the most in the world. They didn't set out to become bankers. War made them rich. Faith made them trustworthy, and necessity made them brilliant. It all started with donations. Nobles who wanted to help the Holy Land gave them land, gold, animals, and even whole villages. The Templars didn't just keep it for themselves. They did it in a careful and planned way. They built groups of people with the same interests all over Europe. Agricultural estates are run like efficient businesses. Everything was accounted for: grain, livestock, and taxes. A monk in England might be sending money to help with a battle in Jerusalem in just a few weeks. That kind of reach was completely new. Then the banking system was introduced. A nobleman traveling to the Holy Land no longer needed to risk carrying a chest full of coins. He could pay money into the Templars' account in Paris, get a letter with a code on it, and then take out the same amount in cash. It was one of the first ways for banks to do business in other countries. Templars charged small fees, kept careful records, and always paid on time. They became the banks of the medieval world like Switzerland is today, but hundreds of years before Switzerland even existed. Their clients were people from all walks of life, including kings, queens, bishops, and merchants. They looked after the French royal family's most valuable jewelry, managed the Pope's money, and paid to set prisoners free. Sometimes, they even lent money to the very kings and queens who later tried to destroy them. The Templars didn't show off how rich they were. They weren't covered in silk or gold. Their churches were simple, and the clothes they wore were plain. But behind the austerity, there was a system of records, safes, and armor wagons. It was like an invisible hand that touched almost every economy in Europe. But they wouldn't call themselves bankers. They were monks, which means they were men who dedicated their lives to religion. They said that everything they did was to do with God. However, the more gold they moved, the more enemies they made. The church didn't do anything. The Templars were only responsible to the Pope. But the kings started to worry. They were indebted to the Templars and couldn't control them. What started out as a mission to protect pilgrims had changed into something else. They were warriors without a war, monks without a monastery, and bankers without a kingdom. As their coffers grew fuller, so did the weight of suspicion. Power without anyone to check it. That's when kings start preparing for war. The Templars were fighting a losing battle. The Crusader states, Outremer, were like castles in the sand. They were constantly attacked by waves of Islamic resurgence. And at the head of that group was Saladin, the clever ruler of Egypt and Syria. Saladin was different from the other Crusader lords. The other lords were often disorganized and fought over small things. Saladin was a unifying force. His only aim was to retake Jerusalem. That goal was achieved at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. The Templars were there, fighting until the end. But they were beaten, tricked, outnumbered, and trapped in the very hot weather. The Christian army was completely destroyed. Saladin captured hundreds of knights. Most of them were paid to be set free. But when it came to the Templars, they showed no mercy. He killed almost all of them. Saladin thought they were too dangerous to keep alive. Losing Jerusalem was bad for more reasons than one. It was a crisis of the spirit. The city they had promised to protect was no longer there. The Holy Book was once again in the hands of Muslims. The Templars' original purpose was starting to fall apart, but they got back together. The Third Crusade brought more soldiers, including Richard the Lionheart, who trusted the Templars and depended on them in battle. But even he couldn't take Jerusalem back. Over the next 100 years, the Crusader states got smaller and smaller. One city after another was taken over. First Antioch, then Tripoli, and finally, in 1291, Aleppo. The last place where the Knights Templar were based in the Holy Land has been taken over. They moved to Cyprus, where they built new headquarters and tried to stay important. But something had changed. They were still warriors, but there was no Holy Land left for them to defend. What were they fighting for? Their castles were empty. Their legends were forgotten. They were known for their discipline, but this was starting to change. At the same time, other orders, like the Hospitallers, were becoming more powerful. People started to say that the Templars were proud, corrupt, and arrogant. Some people whispered that they had become too rich and too secretive. Others said they were collecting dangerous relics. The East had influenced them, shaped them, and broken them. Without it, the Templars were lost. They were still rich, had a lot of contacts, and seemed powerful. But they had lost the thing that was vital to them: a sword without war and a brotherhood without a crusade. And in that situation, powerful enemies were watching. By the start of the 14th century, the Knights Templar were still rich, still feared, and still powerful. But for the first time ever, they were also irrelevant. The Holy Land was lost. There were no more planned religious wars. They had become a military order even though there was no war, a religious order even though there was no clear mission, and a financial powerhouse that answered to no king. This made them a target. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, was the most suspicious and greedy person of them all. People didn't think he was fair because he was very fair. He had a lot of debt and had no money because of wars with England and Flanders. The Templars were the people he owed money to. He had borrowed a lot of money from them to pay for his armies and keep his throne. Philip didn't like owing money, especially to people he couldn't control. Even worse, the Templars were politically independent. They were only answerable to the Pope, not the king. They owned land in France, but they didn't pay taxes to the king. They had their own strongholds, their own courts, and their own armies. To Philip, they were a dangerous group of people living in his state. He couldn't touch them, they couldn't be moved, and they were extremely rich. He started making a plan. Philip started spreading his message. People said that the Templars worshipped idols, spat on the cross, and performed rude initiation rituals. There is no proof, just rumors. But in a time when people believed in superstitions, just a whisper was enough. He put pressure on his puppet pope, Clement V, to investigate. Clement stopped for a moment, but Philip kept going. Philip secretly planned one of the most organized mass arrests ever made in medieval times. He chose a date, got his soldiers ready, and got his torturers ready. On one cold Friday morning in October 1307, Friday the 13th, he attacked. Templar Knights were captured, questioned, and put in prison all over France. They were also tortured. They were made to confess. Some broke in a few hours, while others kept going for a long time. It was a clever combination of treason and justice, and it worked. The public, which had been loyal in the past, started to change their minds. The Pope was under pressure and felt humiliated. He felt trapped. The situation had changed, not in the battle, but in politics. The warrior monks, who had once attacked the enemy, were now locked up in dungeons. They were accused of doing things that no sword could defend. October 13th, 1307. Friday the 13th was forever linked with bad luck in Western culture. At dawn, armed men moved quietly across every corner of France. They were very clear about what they wanted. If you see a Templar, catch them. There was no warning and no resistance allowed. The king's justice had arrived, with swords out and papers signed secretly. Thousands of knights were dragged from their beds. Some were wearing full armor, while others were in church. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was captured in Paris by the very kingdom whose crown jewels he had once protected. Across cities and the countryside, raids were carried out on Templar commanderies. Their vaults were broken open and their libraries were taken. The charges were ridiculous: heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, sodomy, and devil worship. Philip's lawyers invented most of it. But in a time of fear and extreme religious belief, it didn't need to be true. All it needed was to seem real. The Templars were silenced using fire and iron. Torture chambers were being set up all over France. Men were stretched, burned, crushed, and skinned alive until they confessed. They admitted to everything their inquisitors asked them to, including the following: saying that they did not believe in Christ, saying that they worshipped a severed head named Baphomet, saying that they kissed each other in secret ceremonies. Grand Master de Mol admitted something terrible, but then took back what he said. It was like theater, but pretending it was justice. A king destroyed his enemies by accusing them of the most horrible sins. Pope Clement V was made to feel ashamed. He had tried to stop the fight, but Philip had been too quick and too cruel. Clement was forced to take action when he was in a difficult situation. He decided to look into the matter himself. Other countries, like England and Spain, were unsure. Often, the accusations were ignored or the Templars were let go. But in France, the system of punishment continued. Philip took their money, but a lot of it went missing for some unknown reason. Some people were saying that the Templars had moved their treasure. Others said it had never been found. Some people said that knowledge, secrets, relics, the Holy Grail, and the Ark of the Covenant were the real treasures, not gold. Whatever the truth is, it doesn't matter anymore because the damage has already been done. The Templars were not a brotherhood anymore. They were on the run, had been caught, and were dead. The king had used words, not weapons, to hurt people. He had used ink, fire, and lies. The world would never see the Red Cross in the same way again. By 1312, it was clear that things would soon come to an end. The Knights Templar were once the most powerful military order in Christendom, but they had been captured and imprisoned. They were forced to confess to their crimes, and these confessions were then used as a reason for what happened next. And then things just fell apart. King Philip IV put a lot of pressure on Pope Clement V to get rid of the Templar Order. At the Council of Vienna in March 1312, the Pope officially banned the order, took away their titles, lands, and identity. Officially, the Templars were no more. The Holy See said it was a kind act, not a punishment, but something that was needed to stop more problems. The truth is, it was a political killing that was made to look like a religious killing. The order's belongings were given to the Knights Hospitaller, but not all of them made it there. A lot of the Templars' money, treasures, records, and rumored relics just disappeared. Some people said it was hidden. Others thought it was taken in by Philip's treasury without anyone noticing. In any case, the Templars' huge money empire disappeared quickly, like smoke, and left people with only questions. But the final act was still to come. In 1314, Jacques de Mol, the Grand Master, was led out to a scaffold in Paris after having spent 7 years in prison. He was going to be killed along with Jeff de Chara, who was a high-ranking Templar. Both had said that they had lied, and they insisted that the order was innocent. They said that they would be punished for disobeying. They were tied to a wooden stake on a small island in the sea. As the fire got bigger, de Mol shouted through the smoke. He asked God to judge the people who had criticized him. Legend has it that he put a curse on King Philip and Pope Clement, saying they would die within a year, and they did. Clement died of his illness within a month. Philip came later that year out of the blue. Some people said it was just God's will. Others said it was just luck. But people kept on believing this myth. The Templars had died while cursing their killers, and their words had been heard by God. That was the last time anyone spoke for the Knights Templar. They were killed in a fire. Their story ended not with a battle, but with betrayal, torture, and fire. But even though they were erased from the map, their legend was just starting to become well known. The fires used in the Templar executions went out, but the members of their legend were more popular than ever. The group was no longer together. Their castles had been taken, and their leaders had been killed. It looked like their story had finished. But something strange happened. Instead of being forgotten, the Knights Templar changed from being monks who had done something wrong, to being symbols of mystery and power that will always be remembered. What had once kept them safe was now causing rumors to spread. What happened to their treasure? Where were their important religious texts, their treasures, and their spiritual wisdom? Some people thought that the Templars had taken the Holy Grail away before they were arrested. Others whispered that they had hidden the Ark of the Covenant or were protecting Jesus' descendants. There was no evidence, just guesses. In the medieval world, shadows were enough. Then someone had the idea that the Templars had survived by living underground. Although the Templars are officially no longer a group, many of them have lived quietly as normal people. Some joined other religious groups. Some of them became mercenaries, but according to legend, others went into hiding. They secretly formed groups, keeping their traditions and important objects secret and waiting patiently. A long time later, those stories changed into myths. People either praise or criticize the Templars for many things. These include the construction of Gothic cathedrals and the founding of Freemasonry. People started making up conspiracy theories left, right, and center. The Templars had control over banks, thrones, and revolutions. They had never really been beaten. They had just been hiding. There has always been a secret influence working behind the scenes to shape the course of history. Pop culture made things worse. The Knights Templar appeared in books, games, and films. They were sometimes shown as heroes and sometimes as villains. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code made them guardians of holy bloodlines. Assassin's Creed made them a global group of people who secretly control the world. Every time the story was retold, the truth was distorted, but this only made the story more fascinating. The truth about the Templars is that they were real people. They were brave, but they were also religious warriors who tried to combine the promises they made as monks with the violence of war. And they pay the price for that. But people keep believing in myths because they give us something that history often doesn't. Answers, meaning mystery. The real Templars were killed on the rack and in dungeons. But people still imagine the legendary Templars. They think of them as being eternal, wearing armor and cloaked in secrecy. Philip the Fair didn't succeed. He killed them, but their legend is still safe. It's been more than 700 years since the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar was burned alive on the banks of the Seine. But the Red Cross is still in literature, architecture, and symbols carved into old stone. It's also a topic of conversation in conspiracy theories. The Templars may be gone, but their legacy is still alive. They were more than just fighters. They came up with new ideas. Long ago, kings were believed to rule because God had chosen them, and many people thought that banking was wrong. During this time, the Templars created a large network that connected finance, logistics, and diplomacy across all of Europe. Letters of credit were like the first checks. Their commanderies were like the regional branches of a multinational corporation. They were an early example of globalization, created not with stock markets, but with weapons and important promises. In the army, they came up with a new idea of what it meant to be a knight. Before the Templars came along, chivalry was more like a personal code of behavior. It was flexible and often ignored. The Templars made it into an institution, and they made sure that everyone followed the rules by being very strict. They weren't fighting alone for fame and fortune. They were trained like modern special forces. They were ready to die for a vague idea. They did, often without saying anything, sometimes without success, but always making an impression. They changed how the West thought about religion and war. The idea of the warrior monk showed that being holy and being violent were not things that went together. They showed that belief could be used as a weapon. This could be used not just in battle, but in politics, finance, and propaganda too. When they were defeated, it was because of their supposed heresy that they were destroyed. Their fall was a warning. The Templars were known for having complete power. No one was in charge of them, and the Pope protected them. They were richer than kings. When they fell, it showed that even institutions with divine authority can be weak. It was a medieval version of a company being taken over. But it wasn't done by shareholders, it was done by the royal family in Rome. Today, they're more like a myth than a real person. But stories can make it hard to remember things. The memory of the Knights Templar, who were brave but also flawed and betrayed, reminds us that history is also about failures. Sometimes it's written in ashes. Next time you see a red cross on a white cloth, remember that it was once worn by men who believed they were doing God's work. But then politics, ambition, and fear changed their minds. And in that clash of steel, gold, and fire, their legend was born. The world was changing in 12th century Paris. Trade routes were getting bigger, universities were being built, and the church was becoming more powerful than ever before. It was a time when people were ambitious, both in politics and religion, and in building things like houses and churches. And in the middle of the growing city, there was a stone building that was like a dream. Bishop Maurice de Sully of Paris had that dream. He was appointed in 1160. He was more than just a religious leader. He had great vision. The cathedral's old saint was falling apart and not very nice to look at. Paris was getting bigger, and its religious center needed to be as big as the city. So Sully had bigger dreams. He suggested building a cathedral that was so big and impressive that it would make everything around it look small. This monument celebrates both the Virgin Mary and the power and glory of the Catholic Church in France. This wouldn't be a Roman-style fortress like the previous ones. It would be something new, something different, and something dark. The dream started to become real in 1163. The Pope himself, Alexander III, blessed the building by laying the first stone during a special ceremony. Work started on the eastern part of the building, where the choir and apse would be. One day, priests would sing hymns beneath the building's huge glass and stone arches. But this was not a normal construction project. Notre Dame was more than just a building. It was something that was promised by all the generations. The people of Paris, including stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters, and artists, began the work. They brought limestone from nearby quarries, shaped it with medieval tools, and built scaffolding so tall it reached the sky. Every block was laid by hand. Every carving, every window, every rib of the vault was made with patience, faith, and hard work. Even the first sections would take decades to complete. The workers toiled away, sad in the knowledge that they would not live to see the towers completed. Boys get chisels as gifts from their fathers. For many years, the city of Paris was built up around the Notre Dame, which was rising slowly but impressively above the city. Bishop Dully was very clear about what he wanted to achieve. The aim is to build a church that is so beautiful that going inside it will make people feel small and humble. NRAM was never just a church. It was a monument built to honor a god. It was made of stone and showed what people were able to build when they tried to make something beautiful and perfect. The first stone was just the start. What happened next changed the skyline and the spirit of medieval Europe. As the 1170s unfolded, the Notre Dame began to rise. It rose not as a structure, but as a symbol. In a city of narrow wooden houses and muddy streets, the cathedral gradually took shape, rising up over the skyline like a stone monument. The Gothic style was still very new and was about to completely change what churches could look like. They're not just places for praying, but they also inspire awe. The work moved from east to west. It started with the choir, where priests would one day perform sacred rites. Then it moved to the nave, the large open space for ordinary churchgoers. The building's design was new and exciting. It had thin walls and high ceilings. The pointed arches and ribbed vaults allowed more weight to be shifted downwards. They weren't just there to hold up the ceiling, they were singing up to the sky, making people look up and feel spiritual. But perhaps the most revolutionary idea was light. NRAM is different from the old Romanesque churches. It was built to shine. Big windows with stained glass started to appear, letting in colored light and showing shapes that follow a sacred pattern. Images from the Bible spring to life as the sun rises. The church was no longer just a place where stories were told. It lit them up. Every piece of Notre Dame was significant. The columns were more than just supports. They were like saints. The archways weren't just for show. They were the way to be saved. The stone was like a book on religion, and the masons were like its writers. At the same time, Paris was changing outside the city walls. The cathedral became a symbol of life. Markets grouped around it. The words of the sermons could be heard throughout the church. Students from the University of Paris, which was just starting to grow in popularity, gathered in its shadow. Notre Dame was more than just a building. It was becoming the heart and soul of the city. But progress was slow. There were no cranes or power tools, just people using their muscles with scaffolding and a lot of determination. For many years, hundreds of workers worked very hard. When one person died, another person took their place. People rarely wrote down names. They weren't rewarded with fame, but instead with faith. They built for God and for future generations. By 1200, the choir and most of the main part of the church were built. A miracle was starting to happen. The idea of Notre Dame was no longer just a dream. It was made of stone and glass, sweat and prayer. The structure grew higher and higher, and the builders had great ambitions. What they planned next was crazy. Notre Dame was very different from anything the city had ever seen, but it was also very ambitious. As the walls went up and the ceilings got bigger, a problem appeared. The weight. The stone ceilings weren't just pressed downwards, but also outwards. The higher the vaults climbed, the more they threatened to push the walls apart. Romanesque churches found the answer to this problem by building thick walls and small windows. But Notre Dame was built to be beautiful, to shine, and to reach the heavens in both spirit and space. That's when the Masons did something that changed everything. They took a new architectural idea that had not been tested much yet and used it: the flying buttress. These weren't just there to hold things up. They were stone arches that went from the top of the walls down to some pillars. These arches were separate from a main building. They were like big, external supports for the cathedral ceiling. They took the pressure from the ceiling and spread it evenly across the ground, which meant that it could not cause any harm. From the ground, they looked very delicate, like lace made of limestone. But they were very clever and allowed NRAM to become exactly what it was always meant to be: a structure of air, light, and impossible height. Flying buttresses changed everything. The builders were able to add more windows because the pressure was off the interior walls. The magnificent rose windows and the huge wheels of stained glass showing saints, angels, and scenes from the apocalypse were now a reality. They became real. Color burst into the sacred space. Stories about God were not just told from the pulpit, the raised platform in a church where the priest or preacher stands and delivers his sermon, but also from sunlight itself. The original plans for Notre Dame didn't include flying buttresses, which is strange because they are a characteristic feature of the building. The people who built the early Gothic style hadn't yet realized how great it could be. But as the structure grew, so did the strain on it. The Masons changed their plan quickly, and they did it on the spot. People started adding stone wings to buildings in the early 1200s. This was because they needed to, but it also made the buildings look beautiful. People were divided about it at the time. Some people didn't like the exposed supports because they thought they looked ugly and ruined the smooth look of the building. But most people were amazed. Notum looked like it was being held up by stone angels while it was flying. The cathedral was more than just a place for religious worship. It showed what can be achieved by combining faith and maths. A hymn carved into very hard rock, and its wings had only just started to spread. By the early 1200s, the skyline of Paris had already been changed by Notre Dame, but its most famous features were still being built. Work was nearing completion at the eastern end, so people started to look to the west. The rose that grew there would become the cathedral symbol. This is the part that most people would notice right away. The two tall buildings and a large west-facing front. This front wasn't just a doorway. It was a statement about spirituality, architecture, and politics. The church wanted you to feel small when you got close to it, and it worked. The doors went really high. Above them, there were rows of sculptures of kings, prophets, saints, and demons watching every visitor. You weren't just going into a building. You were about to be judged by a higher power. The construction of the West Towers began around 1200-1220. Everything at Notre Dame takes a long time to make. The towers were built bit by bit and got higher and higher until they were almost 70 meters tall. But they were never finished how they were planned to be. They don't have pointy bits, just big flat tops. They look majestic and simple. Between the towers was the Gallery of Kings, which had 28 statues of the kings of Judah. During the French Revolution, these statues were mistaken for French kings and cut off their heads by angry mobs. But in the 13th century, they made their feelings very clear. They believed that God had the right to rule, that order from heaven was important, and that religion should be the foundation of government. The church and the crown were closely linked, and this was their front porch. Below them, there were 3 great portals that told stories about religion using stone. The main one, the entrance to the afterlife, was carved with a picture of Jesus sitting in heaven, with angels, demons, and souls of people who had died and been brought back to life. For the many people who can't read or write, these scenes weren't just for show. They were doctrine. The message was clear. Come in with respect. Eternity starts here. Above the doors, a rose window appeared. It was almost 10 meters across. It was surrounded by detailed patterns and statues of the Virgin Mary and Child. Light passed through the colored glass like a spotlight that made it look like saints were being projected across the room. By the middle of the 13th century, the towers were almost finished. The front of the building was complete, serious, and balanced, and it made a big impression. It was a symbol of religious belief, a display of God's power, and a reminder to those who sinned. Even so, the builders weren't finished. Notre Dame's heart was still to be completed. The transept, the roof, and the spire that would one day be seen above the clouds. They had built its front part. Now, they would give a crown. The towers and the west facade were standing proud, defying gravity. This meant that the Notre Dame was becoming more than just a shell. It needed to have a soul. That soul was inside the big church, in the nave, the transepts, and the choir. These were the places where monks would speak, kings would walk, and thousands of people would pray. By the mid-1200s, work had moved on to the transepts. These were the arms of the cross-shaped layout that gave Gothic cathedrals their iconic floor plan. The architect Gilles and later Pierre de Montreuil expanded and decorated these wings with new rose windows, which were even more ornate than those at the western end. The north transept had a bright window that filled the space with cool blues and lovely purples. The south is warmer and more fiery, but just as wonderful. These weren't just design choices. They were full of religious symbolism. The window on the north side was for the Old Testament, and the window on the south side was for the New Testament. The two wings told the whole story of salvation. One is bright like a light, the other is bright like fire. Inside the cathedral, tall columns looked like tree trunks in a forest made of stone. The ceilings were raised and arched, stretching almost 35 meters high. This wasn't architecture. It was like a dance with a movement that went up like a soul flying towards heaven. And then there was the altar, which was the most important part of the space. The celebration of the Mass took place here. People came here to worship the relics. And here, the French elite came to kneel. Royal weddings, coronation masses, and papal visits. Notre Dame became a symbol of the nation itself. But the walls were filled not just by the elite. The people came too. People who sold things, people who worked on the land, and people who went on religious trips. The cathedral was used as a public place of worship, where people would listen to sermons, sing, and sometimes be told off from the pulpit. It was a place where you could see amazing miracles or ask for one. Every surface inside had a story to tell. Everything, including the sculptures, the stained glass, and the floor tiles. NRAM wasn't just a place for the divine. It did the job. Faith was everywhere. It is written in stone, it floats in incense, and it shines from glass. By the late 13th century, they had finished most of the interior. The cathedral's heart was beating strongly, but it still needed one thing, a crown to pierce the heavens. They started building the spire at that point. By the end of the 1200s, Nostradamus was already thought to be a miracle worker. The church tower was very tall, the inside was filled with religious songs, and the stained glass windows let in a lot of sunlight. But something still felt unfinished. The cathedral had a face, a heart, and wings, but no crown. There was nothing to make the eye move up from the roof and into the sky. That's when people started making plans for the spire. The spire would be different from the Twin Towers. The Twin Towers were heavy and felt like they were touching the ground. The spire would be light and tall. It would be an upward-pointing needle rising from the crossing of the transept. This is in the center of the church's cruciform layout. The original spire was built using oak wood and covered in lead. It was both a technical challenge to build and a spiritual statement. This wasn't just for show. It was the most obvious part of Notre Dame's prayer. Master carpenters and metal smiths were needed to build it. People used things like pulleys and winches to lift the oak beams, using their own muscles. The building had to be strong, but not too heavy, because it was in a place where it would often be windy. When it was finished, the tall part of the building went up into the sky, and below it, there was even more detailed work happening. Gargoyles are strange creatures that come out of stone. They weren't just grotesque for fun. There was a reason for it. Many of them were used as water spouts, which meant that rain was diverted away from the masonry. Some symbols were supposed to frighten evil away or remind sinners of what happened to them. The last part of the project involved lots of chimes and statues of strange animals high up overlooking Paris, their eyes looking out to the horizon. They were both a nightmare and a marvel, and were part of a Gothic love story full of mystery and symbolism. The chapels were finished, the choir stalls were carved, and the relics were put in. NRAM was now fully up and running, both as a special machine and as a place for the nation to come together. It had taken over 100 years to build, and many thousands of workers had been involved. The whole kingdom had believed in it. By 1345, almost 200 years after the first stone was put in place, people thought the cathedral was finished. Complete is the wrong word. Notre Dame was never stuck in the past. It would be brought back into existence over and over again, with each revival taking place in a different era. But by the 14th century, they had finished building the structure itself. The Gothic age built its most impressive work. By the mid-14th century, Notre Dame de Paris was more than just a cathedral. It was the cathedral, a huge symbol of Catholic power, royal rule, and national identity. For the next 400 years, it was the center of Paris and a place where some of France's most important events took place. It became the most important place for the state religion, where kings and queens were crowned, royal weddings were held, and important funerals took place. When kings wanted to get married, they did it in the big hall. When wars were declared or victories celebrated, the bells of Notre Dame rang loudly across the land. Monarchs came in as rulers of land and left as chosen of God. But kings weren't the only people to pass through those great doors. Important people like generals, bishops, and representatives from other countries came to either kneel or negotiate. When disasters struck, like famines, plagues, or invasions, the Parisians filled the main part of the church with prayers and processions. They were desperate for God to help them. The cathedral was a place where people found hope and fear. It was always watching and always waiting. Politically speaking, the National Rifle Association for the Americas, NRA, became an important part of the French monarchy. Its central location on the Isle de la site at the literal and symbolic heart of Paris made it the perfect backdrop for ritualized power. Before the war, priests blessed flags. The crown was seen as being connected to both royal blood and a divine mandate. If the king ruled France, then NRAM ruled his soul. It was also a place of awe in terms of culture. People traveled long distances to see the holy objects, including the crown of thorns, which was believed to have been worn by Jesus himself. The church's great organ played during religious festivals. The choirs sang music that was very different, and it was the first of its kind. Notre Dame wasn't a static figure. It changed over time, taking on new art styles, musical traditions, and literary forms. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, people started to like it less. The style of architecture that was popular at the time was Baroque. In contrast, the architectural style of NRAM was considered old-fashioned and medieval. Some changes were made to make it look more modern, making what had once been a bold look less obvious. Even so, it remained a cathedral, standing between two centuries, loved and respected but also ignored. Its towers had withstood storms and time, and its bells still told their story, but something was changing beneath its foundations. NRAM started with faith and was later recognized by kings. But soon it would have to deal with a force that even stone couldn't resist. Big change. When the French Revolution started in 1789, Napoleon de Paris found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. For hundreds of years, it had been a symbol of the monarchy and religion, two of the things the revolution wanted to get rid of. The cathedral, which had once been used to crown kings, became a symbol of oppression. During revolutions, symbols like this are usually damaged or destroyed. The attack was both ideological and physical. Revolutionaries suddenly attacked the cathedral. People thought the statues of the kings from the Bible that decorated the outside of the building were French kings. All 28 people were killed by having their heads cut off. Sculptures were smashed. Altars have been defiled. The big bells that had once sounded to announce royal births and papal visits were broken up and melted down to make canon metal. Valuable items like the crown of thorns were taken away and kept secret. Many people died. All that was left was a hollow shell. The monastery of Notre was officially closed in 1793. It was no longer a church. Instead, it was changed to become the so-called Temple of Reason. This was used for revolutionary festivals celebrating the rise of the Enlightenment. It was even used as a warehouse for storing wine at one point. The big church, which used to be filled with the sound of people singing hymns, now smelt of old wine and damp stone. The spire was damaged and falling apart, so it was eventually taken apart to make it safer. Gargoyles fell from their perches. The roof let in water. Rats ran through the crypt. It looked like Paris had lost its spirit. It was just an old, forgotten city center. And yet it didn't die. When Napoleon came to power, he understood the importance of the symbolism of the NRAM. In 1804, He chose the location for his own coronation as emperor. The cathedral was made ready for the big event by having it cleaned and being made holy again. But this wasn't a religious thing. It was all a performance. Napoleon crowned himself, taking the crown from the Pope's hands. Notre Dame once again served the powerful, but without the respect it had once had. But you can still see the effects of years of being ignored. By the 1830s, the Notre Dame was falling apart, both in terms of its physical structure and its spiritual well-being. It was supposed to be knocked down more than once. Some people in Paris thought it would be better to replace it with something more modern, less medieval, and less haunting. Then a writer got involved. A writer who would see past the broken stones and broken statues to something eternal, something worth saving. The world was just about to forget about NRAM when Victor Hugo brought it back to people's minds. A book was published in 1831 that would save a cathedral. Victor Hugo's NRAM Depart, later known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was more than just a Gothic novel. It was a plea that was full of passion and asked for the building to be kept safe. Hugo turned NRAM into more than just a backdrop through the eyes of Quasimodo, the deformed bell ringer. It was like a living character, hurt, not understood, and beautiful even though it was falling apart, and the public listened. The novel made people feel emotional all over France. Parisians suddenly realized what they were about to lose. Notre Dame wasn't just old. It was a masterpiece, a monument to centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. People complained, and it worked. In 1844, King Louis Philippe agreed to pay for the cathedral to be completely rebuilt. The two architects leading the way were Eugen Violet-Luc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. They wanted to fix the cathedral, but also make it feel like it was still a place of worship. They replaced statues that had worn out, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and reimagined the spire that had been taken down during the Revolution. The new spire, designed by Viola Luck, would be 96 meters tall. It would be taller and more decorative than the original. It would become one of Europe's most famous shapes. Between the 1800s and 1900s, the city of Paris was the center of spiritual and cultural life. It was used for church services and was the venue for ceremonies that marked the end of slavery. It also welcomed millions of visitors. It was able to make it through 2 world wars. During the Nazi occupation, the bells were silent. When Paris was finally liberated in 1944, they sounded their victory bells. Sadly, something terrible happened again. On April 15th, 2019, there was a fire under the roof. In just a few minutes, the wooden lattice, known as the forest, was engulfed in flames. Some of the beams are from the 13th century. The fire lasted for hours. The roof collapsed. The tall 19th century tower fell down in a cloud of smoke. The world watched in horror as one of the world's most famous buildings seemed to disappear right in front of them. Once again, it survived. The stone towers didn't move. The rose windows lasted. The relics were saved. France and the rest of the world promised to rebuild. NRAM has always been about more than just architecture. It is about memory, identity, strength, a church, a symbol, and survival. And in every stone that grows out of the ashes, it shows us that faith and beauty can come back to life. She was born in China in 1775 in the province of Guangdong. No one ever recorded her real name. People would remember her by another name, Jung Yi-saw, wife of Jung Yi. But what she did with that name would cause great change, even to empires. When she was young, she was a prostitute on a boat that traveled from place to place and had many women working on it. This was common for poor girls in China on the coast in the 18th century. These flower boats provided food and other amenities for merchants, naval officers, and pirates. But she was different from the others. She listened. She watched. She could remember people's names. She was able to get important clients to speak. As time went on, she became more than just a form of entertainment. She started working as an information broker. Then Jung E arrived. He was a powerful pirate leader and the boss of the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most dangerous pirate groups in the South China Sea. He wasn't the first pirate she served, but he would be the last. Jung E impressed him with her clever behavior, so he asked her to marry him. She agreed, but only if certain conditions were met. She did something that almost no one did at that time. She managed to get her job. She wanted to have a say in how the fleet was run, not just as a wife, but as a partner too. She would be in charge of political alliances, manage plunder, and have a say in every important decision. Jungi agreed. He knew she was valuable, either because he loved her or because he was clever. They got married in 1801, and this was the start of one of the most successful pirate families in history. Geneso quickly became an important part of the pirate political scene. She looked closely at how pirates were organized, the rivalries between groups, and the unwritten rules of their society. While she was out sailing and conquering, Jungi was also quietly building networks, finding allies, and learning to rule from the shadows. But she didn't stay hidden for long. When Jung E died suddenly in 1807, possibly in a typhoon, many people thought his empire would fall apart. Many pirate captains were ready to take advantage of the situation, hoping to fill any power gap that might have appeared. What they got was a power grab. Jung Yao took charge, not by being forceful, but by using clever tactics. She became the boss of the Red Flag Fleet. She made friends with other leaders and married Jungi's adopted son, Chungpo Sai, who was also the Pirate Queen's lieutenant. This made sure she had the loyalty of the people and the strength of the army. She went from being a prostitute to a pirate queen in less than 10 years. She had only just begun. When Jung Yao took charge in 1807, she didn't just get a pirate fleet. She was given a kingdom that was floating. But instead of it falling apart after her husband died, she made it stronger. During her time in charge, the Red Flag Fleet not only survived, but also prospered. It increased a lot. There have always been pirates in the South China Sea, but what Jung Esau commanded was completely new. She was in charge of a fleet of over 300 ships, and within a year, that number had increased to more than 600. It is thought that she eventually was in charge of over 1,800 ships and 70,000 men. This was more than the combined navies of several European countries at that time. She did this in a very practical way, and because she understood what pirates were like. She kept her power not just by being strong, but by making a system that tied her captains to her. She created a strict set of laws that applied to every part of pirate life, including how they behaved to each other, how they were disciplined, and how they were punished. If you disobeyed, the punishment was quick and severe. Anyone caught stealing from the shared money would be killed. If a pirate attacked a woman prisoner without permission, he would be killed. If a pirate left the group, his ears would be cut off, and he would be made to walk through the fleet as a warning to the others. But it wasn't just fear. Jung Esau offered safety, organization, and money. Her code made sure that pirates got to keep 20% of the loot, and the rest went into a fund that she managed. This made the system fair for everyone and made people loyal to it because it was stable. Even defeated rivals and people who lived on the coast often chose to join her instead of fighting against her. She split the huge fleet into 6 groups, each with its own color: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green. But all the groups had to report to her. Her closest ally and second in command, Chungpo Sai, was in charge of the Red Squadron, her elite force. Jung Yao's pirates were like a government. They had their own taxes, army, and leaders. She was in charge of all the ships that traveled from Vietnam to Hong Kong. She decided what goods could be traded, attacked important places, and even made coastal towns pay taxes. The Qing dynasty had a navy. Yung Yao's business was doing really well and getting bigger all the time. Yung Yao was a charismatic ruler. She was a strict ruler. Although pirates are often thought of as being wild and disorderly, her fleet was more like a well-organized business. At the heart of this structure was her pirate code. This was a detailed system of laws that turned chaos into order. This code wasn't some love letter that was passed around in a romantic setting by candlelight. It was cruel, it was controlling, and it was enforced straight away. Every captain and crew member knew how important the mission was. Breaking the rules would lead to one of two things: humiliation or death. One of the most well-known rules was about how the spoils were divided. After a raid, everyone had to take their loot to the main storehouse in the fleet. The pirate who was responsible got 20% of the money, and the rest went into the shared pool. That pool, which was run by young Esau and her team, was used for different things. It was used to pay the pensions of widows, to pay bribes, and as an emergency fund. It was not just considered wrong to take from the group. It was a very serious crime, and the punishment could be death. Then came discipline. If you disobeyed in battle, you would be punished. Anyone who was too scared to keep their squadron together or who did not follow orders could be whipped, killed, or thrown into the sea. Leave the desert and be killed. The code even talked about relationships. If a pirate kidnapped a woman, he had to treat her well. If someone was found guilty of sexual assault, they would be executed by beheading. She didn't like chaos. She liked to be in control, and the code gave her that. It created a reliable system where pirates knew what the rules were, what would happen if they broke them, and how much of the booty they would get. People were loyal not just to Yung Saw as a leader, but to the system she represented too. Amazingly, she let prisoners and people living on the coast join her army. In exchange, they promised to follow her rules. Many people did. Some people joined because they were scared, while others joined because they really liked the idea. Some people realized that in the world of young Esau, piracy was safer, more profitable, and, strangely, more fair than life under the corrupt authorities. Her laws were not just for ships. Coastal villages that she was protecting paid tribute to her in exchange for her to protect them and give them safety and independence. People who refused to give in were set on fire and killed. People who did what she asked became part of her growing group of followers. She wasn't just a pirate. She was the ruler of her country, and her code was the law. By 1808, Zhang Yaiso's pirate group had become a big problem. It was a threat to the whole country. Her group of ships was the strongest in the South China Sea. It stopped trade and attacked coastal towns without being punished. The Qing dynasty was embarrassed and overwhelmed, so it had to do something. But they weren't prepared for the challenge they faced. The Imperial Navy started a big attack to defeat the pirates. They sent many warships to find Yung Yao's fleet. After that, there was a series of quick victories, but it was a humiliating display of how badly the empire was run. The Navy was beaten many times by Yung Yao's forces. They were better at fighting, had better weapons, and were more skillful. She knew the waters better than anyone else. She used the weather, the size of the islands, and the depth of the water to make it hard for the Qing ships to get through. Her sailors could fight together, switch ships in the middle of the battle, and lure enemies into ambushes with great accuracy. Many times, whole Qing groups of ships were captured. Their ships were then added to the Red Flag fleet. The difference in morale was huge. Young Esau's men were well organized and fiercely loyal. They were also brave and not afraid to take risks. They were not like the imperial officers, who were often dishonest, not paid enough, and cowardly. As the battles continued, it was clear that the Qing dynasty was getting desperate. They asked the European powers, especially the Portuguese and the British, to help in battles at sea. The ships of the foreign navies were more advanced, but they lacked the local knowledge and unity of purpose that Genghis Shah's armada possessed. But the pressure kept on growing. By 1809, a group of troops from Qing, Portuguese and Cantonese forces had surrounded some of her ships. But even then, she fought them off. She moved back quickly and hit her enemies when they weren't expecting it. She wasn't just getting by. She was making the empire look bad. But the war was costly. The ongoing conflict used up supplies and made the men very tired. Even the biggest pirate empires can't keep fighting wars forever. And while she had not been defeated at sea, Yun Yao understood something very important. Sometimes being in control isn't about always being right. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stop and not get hurt. She didn't want to die at sea or be taken as a prisoner to China. She had a different plan that would surprise even her enemies. By 1810, Yun Sa had achieved the impossible. She had defeated the powerful Qing dynasty, made foreign navies feel ashamed, and ruled the seas with complete control. But she was also practical. She knew that wars, especially ones that had many fronts and more enemies, couldn't go on forever. There are not many supplies left. The people she was allied with were not getting along. And even though her fleet was still huge, it was starting to get worn out. So she changed her approach. Zheng Gao didn't ask the Qing government to give up. Instead, he offered them some conditions. She knew she had the upper hand. The Qing dynasty had not been able to defeat her using military force. Their own people were more afraid of her than they liked the empire. She could negotiate, not as a criminal asking for mercy, but as a leader of country. She traveled to Guangzhou on her own ship with armed guards. She was flying the red flag of the fleet, which shows that she was a member of that group of ships. It wasn't a plea. It was a clever move. She asked for amnesty for herself and her whole fleet of pirates, which was thousands strong. She said she wanted to be able to keep her money. She even made sure that her second-in-command and husband, Cheng Po-ai, was given a military rank in the Qing Navy. The government was shocked, but the truth was that they were tired as well. The empire couldn't afford to spend more money and time on another long and costly war. They agreed, which was unusual because they were thinking about how practical it was. Genghis Khan gave up in a grand way. On April 18, 1810, she led over 17,000 pirates, men, women, and children, into the city. They marched in a procession, not in chains. More than 200 ships were given to the authorities. Weapons were put down in a special ceremony, and all the pirates went home without any violence. Nobody will be put on trial, nobody will be executed, and nobody will lose their wealth. Cheng Po-ai was made captain of ship in the Qing Navy. Young Isa retired as a free woman. She was untouched, undefeated, and still very rich. Most pirate stories end with betrayal or death, but young Isa ended with negotiation and retirement. She had played the game perfectly. First, she used the cannons. Then, she used the words. Her popularity was just starting to grow when her red banners were taken down. Most stories about pirates end in bloodshed, executions, or people forget about them. But Yun Yao didn't just manage to avoid that fate. She built a second life from it. After the biggest pirate surrender ever, she left as a respected, rich woman, not as a criminal. After giving up her fleet in 1810, she moved to Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, with her husband, Cheng Po-ai. He was now a captain in the Qing Navy. Going from being a pirate queen to a normal person might seem silly, but for Yun Yao, it was just another way of staying alive. She lived her life in a way that was open and comfortable, and the Qing government mostly left her alone. Instead of becoming forgotten, she became a businesswoman without anyone noticing. She started a gambling house and a business illegally selling opium, but she was able to get away with it because of the power she had. She didn't want to start another business, but she also didn't want to be forgotten. She kept her friends, looked after her money, and lived her life the way she wanted to. She was married to Chungpo Sai for a long time, and they had children together. He carried on working for the Qing Navy, hunting down pirates who were very similar to the people they used to be. Yung Yao concentrated on their business interests. She moved in high society, gave advice on maritime matters, and was a well-known figure among sailors and traders along the South China coast. What's really amazing is not just that she survived, but also the way she did it. She was very different from the type of woman expected of her by society. She was born poor and was forced to work as a prostitute, but she was determined to succeed and ended up rising to the top of a world dominated by men. Instead of dying in battle or on the scaffold, a place of execution, she lived out her final years peacefully and died of old age in 1844 at the age of 69. She didn't try to make things better. She didn't need it. She chose to live her life in a way that was openly and directly against all the laws, traditions, and social rules that were meant to control her. In a time when women were not allowed to speak in public, Yung Yao was in charge of fleets, dictated treaties, and negotiated with emperors. And then she walked away richer and freer than any pirate ever was. She lowered her sails and stopped firing her cannons, but people still talked about her across the sea. People remember pirates like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Henry Morgan. These men traveled around the Caribbean, causing chaos, and were killed violently. But when you think about how famous they are, you can't forget young Esau. She was their equal and even better in many ways. She didn't just captain a few ships. She was in charge of all the ships. She didn't just take a few things from some towns on the coast. She was in charge of huge parts of the sea. She didn't die when they killed her or in a gunfight. She escaped from being a pirate and found peace. She is one of the most famous pirate legends, but she is also one of the least understood. But don't think her success was just luck or ruthlessness. It was a clever plan, it was smart thinking, and it was also about knowing how to use power. She was good at making plans, working with people, and understanding people. She knew how to make people loyal by scaring them, but also by keeping them in line, rewarding them well, and having a system that was carefully planned. What made her so special was that she did all this as a woman in China during the Qing dynasty. At that time, women were treated very badly and had little voice. Women weren't expected to be leaders, either in the marketplace or on the high seas. Young Esau didn't just go against the norm, she completely broke it. She gained the respect of pirate captains who were used to being in charge. She got the Qing dynasty to start negotiating, and she ended her life as a business owner and mother. She didn't need a man's money. She took it, made some changes to it, and made her own. Most people don't know much about her. She's not as famous as the men she's with, and she doesn't get as much romance in Western books and history. But in the world of seafaring tales and legends, she is a source of wonder. The Red Flag Fleet may be gone forever, but the memory of Yung Yao remains. It's like a ghost ship, silent and untouchable, and still as big as life itself. She was not just a pirate, she was also a woman, and she became so famous that she made empires give in. In a world ruled by men, she didn't demand to be included. She took the whole ocean. Even though he had the biggest pirate fleet ever, Yung Yao is not often mentioned in most history books. She left behind her a huge legacy, but this has now been hidden from view. It has been overshadowed by stories about Western pirates and hidden under layers of bias against women, prejudice against women, and political discomfort. Why? Her story is different from the usual type of story. She wasn't a tragic anti-hero like Blackbeard. She did not die in the war. She wasn't from Europe. And most threatening of all, she was a woman who outplayed an empire. She was better than the empire. That kind of power changes the simple story that historians have always preferred, which is about men being in charge. In official Chinese records, she is seen more as someone who has solved a problem than as someone whose work should be studied. The Qing dynasty didn't want to celebrate her. They wanted to forget her. In the end, she showed that the navy was weak, refused to obey the rulers, and got away without being punished. She was an embarrassment to the throne, even though she was successful. Western historians had the same problem. People in Europe have romanticized piracy for hundreds of years. Peg legs, rum, parrots, and plunder. Yun Yao didn't fit that image. She wasn't fighting with her sword. She was strategic. She didn't fight for fame. She fought for the top spot. The state was not responsible for her death. She made an agreement with it and was successful. Many chroniclers found that boring. It was inconvenient. But in recent decades, her legend has become popular again. Scholars, historians who focus on women's rights, and people who love pirates have started to bring her back to life again. They're putting her back in the story of how countries became powerful through their use of boats. Documentaries, historical novels, and even video games are now talking about the pirate queen of the South China Sea. There is still so much about her life that we do not know. We don't know her real name. We only know about much of her voice thanks to the people who hated her, like Qing officials, foreign sailors, and later, European observers. But what we know is enough to create the outline of a giant. She was more than just a woman who was different. She was a woman who didn't care about anything. Yungu Yisa didn't need the world permission to become powerful. She took control, used it well, and disappeared into history with more money, power, and respect than any pirate, man or woman, in the past or the future. She didn't fade. She was forgotten. But, as always, stories about legendary people are remembered again. Jingyo wasn't wearing a crown. She didn't need to. She was not born into a royal family, so she did not have royal blood. It came from the top, from respect, from fear, from thousands of people shouting her orders across the waves. She was truly a queen, ruling over a kingdom without any limits, flags, or fixed territory. Her territory was the South China Sea, extending from the Gulf of Tonkin to the coast of Guangdong. She invented something that no one had ever invented before, and no one has invented since. Her group of pirates was not just criminal. It was organized by politicians, and it was working well. She was in charge of trade routes, created legal codes, negotiated treaties, and made sure there was order in a region that even the Qing Empire found difficult to govern. Her ships weren't raiders that were spread out. They were groups of ships. Her captains weren't self-employed. They were in the army. Her people were not criminals. They were citizens of a nation that was floating. And yet, what makes her legacy truly unique is not just her rise, but her exit. Most stories about pirates end with the pirates being killed by being burned at the stake. Young Esau ended up in negotiation, then retired and became rich. She didn't die with her ship. She got off it without a scratch and still had the money. By the time she died in 1844, she had achieved something that no pirate, emperor, or general had ever done before. She chose to leave her position of power and avoid a negative reputation. Today, there are only a few monuments with her name on them. There is no palace or statue in the square, but her presence still haunts the South China Sea like a storm cloud that never went away. Sailors whisper it, rebel women write it, and those who understand that leadership is not about who you are born to, but about what you want to do. Jingyo showed that being great doesn't need to be approved of. Even in a world that tries to silence women, one strong, clever voice can command an entire empire. She was in charge and didn't say sorry. She fought without hesitation, and she retired without losing. She was a real person who conquered the sea and lived to tell the tale. Her sails are gone, but her shadow is still visible on the waves.